The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. And now introducing 2023 Sine Fellow, Alida Garcia.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome to today's Sine Institute Fellow Seminar. My name is Ava Gadden, and I'm the Administrative Assistant for Sine. On behalf of the Sine Institute and myself, thank you so much for joining us for this event today. The Sine Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest in the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. The Institute is where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It is where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. Today, we are honored to have a Sine Fellow Alida Garcia and featured guest Maria Praeli join us. Alida Garcia is currently the Vice President for Advocacy at Forward.us, a bipartisan advocacy organization primarily focused on passing common sense immigration and criminal justice reform policies. She has also served as the Senior Advisor on Migration for the Biden-Harris Administration and has been a national leader in many immigration political fights. Joining Ms. Garcia today is featured guest Maria Praeli, who also works at Forward.us, where she currently serves as their Deputy Director of Government Relations and Coalitions. Ms. Praeli moved to the United States from Peru when she was 5 and has dedicated her professional career to fighting for pro-immigrant federal policies. Ms. Garcia and Ms. Praeli have joined us on campus today to continue the conversation over immigration renovation and working to find a path forward in America's immigration system. Through this issue, they will continue to help us interrogate how policy change damages or supports the building of a welcoming nation, and will educate us on the nuances of navigating narratives in policy campaigns and how narrative choices impact individuals, groups, and cultures. Please welcome me again in joining both Alida Garcia and Maria Praeli.
Thank you, Ava. So really excited to be here because our last two conversations, we kind of looked at the DREAM movement over a longer horizon of over 10 years. And then in our last conversation, we dug more into cultural narrative with people who are holding sort of large distribution of message across various medium. But today we're gonna get to where the rubber hits the road, or whatever the saying is, with the nuance, the grittiness, and in many days the disappointment of working with actual policymakers day in, day out on this issue in a bipartisan fashion, and what that is like, and sort of what through lessons on that we can sort of glean on the road ahead. And so I'm really excited to have Maria join us today. Because I thought it was important for all of you who are students to know that you don't have to be like 50 years old to be leading with the United States Senate and the Congress. The work is being done by 20-somethings. I don't even know how old you are, but it's young. It's not, we're not the same age. I always joke about this. I put these pictures up here to embarrass her a little bit, but like Maria is like the sole human being who has like met in the Oval Office on immigration with the last two Democratic presidents. As you can see here, she was a little baby advocate with President Obama, and then she actually led this meeting in the Oval Office with President Biden, which was his first Oval Office meeting unmasked in 2021. So it was like a really awesome day, and she's there with other undocumented leaders. But what we're going to talk about today is actually the harder work of trying to get Democrats and Republicans to work on policy together. And so I thought we would dig in. Well, actually, before I go to the next slide, would love anybody to tell me when they hear the words comprehensive immigration reform, what does that policy-wise mean for you? Do we have any volunteers? Go for it.
Providing a pathway for undocumented immigrants to obtain citizenship.
That's great. Which undocumented immigrants? You don't have to have the answers.
Not totally sure.
Anything else? Anyone else have any other?
Secure the border.
Secure the border. Anyone else? Yes, in the back.
The interests of the business elite.
The interests of the business elite. Anyone else?
Equal opportunities for everyone.
Equal opportunities for everyone. Jack?
Citizenship.
Citizenship and what that means. Great. So here's one big problem about immigration. Comprehensive immigration reform is actually a bipartisan compromise policy framework that does a lot of things. It is rooted in the political debate around a pathway to citizenship for the roughly 11 million undocumented people in the United States, although the deal space of the last many years has not been anything that would legalize 11 million undocumented people. It also is rooted in secure the border, which is actually in many ways a political conversation, but around the idea of, well, if we're gonna, and I'm sort of, these aren't my own opinions, I'm speaking as though I'm a member of Congress. Well, well, we're gonna give those people green cards, we got to make sure it never happens again, and that we don't have future undocumented people that need green cards. So what are we going to do about that? And so that's like the political talking point around the border. And then one piece, sort of related to the business elite comment, but not, is the talking point of, well, if we're going to give them a pathway to citizenship, they can't cut in line in front of other immigrants who are trying to come to the United States who have done it the right way. And so that talking point is actually rooted in what is our very broken existing immigration system, where people are applying for employment or family visas and are caught in backlogs that for some countries and some categories could be like 100 years until you'd be granted your green card. So there's a lot of fraud in the brokenness of the American immigration system. And then the business interest piece of that in many ways is around employment-based visas and what are those categories, what are the rights of the immigrants who are using those categories within those visa processes. And so when we hear elected officials say comprehensive immigration reform, I actually think that they would give a similar set of answers that this group had, which is they don't actually have a defined policy point for all of those sort of like different legs of the stool that hold up the CIR phrase. In many ways, it's just a political phrase that means nothing to everyone. And so what it's meant for over the last many years is it's adapted to the politics of whatever year that deal framework has been. So I'm gonna maybe do this right, maybe not. Maybe I turn it off. Sorry. Oh, maybe I did that. Well, we could just talk it through. So I wanted to talk through some deal spaces. Great. Over the last, gosh, I guess that's 6 years that Maria and I have worked on together. So obviously the fight for CIR has been many decades in the making and built off of the work of many other people over many years. Wanted to just give a snapshot of recent history that all of these times that we've fought for an immigration deal have been bipartisan. Well, one of them was Democrat only, which we'll talk about, but bipartisan efforts since the Trump era for quote unquote CIR. So in 2017, Senators Durbin and Graham, they had a DREAM Act bill that they took to President Trump that had about $3 billion in border security. That included about $1 billion something for his wall. It had changes to the diversity visa and family migration. And it had the DREAM Act, which would have legalized about 2 million people. That deal blew up. Then in 2018, there were pushes. President Trump had his own, it wasn't a bipartisan deal, so I didn't put it here, but he had his own policy. Senator Rounds and Senator King, which is like an independent Republican bill, had a pathway to citizenship bill that Maria and I actually worked on that had $25 billion in border security. Simultaneously, there were efforts with Senator McCain, Senator Coons, along with Representative Hurd and Representative Aguilar, who's actually one of the top ranking Democrats in the House now. That was the DREAM Act plus 110 million a year for 5 years on border security. And then in 2021, when President Biden came into office, we worked on trying to, through the budget reconciliation process, which is a Democrat, because Democrats are in a majority, sort of a partisan endeavor, to try to get a pathway to citizenship for about 7 million people with none of the other stuff. So that would have been for Dreamers, TPS folks, farm workers, and essential workers. That was shot down by the Senate parliamentarian. And then in this last December and currently, Senator Sinema and Senator Tillis are working on a bipartisan framework, which would legalize approximately 2 million people. I think a little bit more than that. But then, as you can see, a lot of asylum policy started to enter into the deal space. And I think that this is a marker of a policy shift that we're facing now in immigration, where border security is actually asylum law. And those two things are one and the same. And I think that that's something that people are going to have to grapple with. So wanted to give you all sort of this overview, because when we talked about CIR right before this, we were talking about 11 million people. And I'm not sure anything on this board over the last 6 years screams 11 million on the table. And so I think we're in many times having political conversations that are like not matching the policy reality, and there's a gap that needs to be built. So I'd love to chat with you, Maria, a little bit. You know, if you remember going back to 2017, would love to kind of hear what it felt like as a young impacted person in the Trump era to work on the Hill and like talk to bipartisan lawmakers, and like how heard did you feel in that moment, and how and what were some of the tactics in doing that work that, like, even though President Trump, who rescinded DACA, was in charge, you were able to help build a coalition in a campaign that resulted in multiple floor votes in a McConnell-led Senate on the issue you were working on.
Sure. And hello, everyone. So happy to be with you today. I think before jumping into that, something that is hard yet really something to be proud of is all the opportunities that we have had. And although we have not been successful, unfortunately, these opportunities don't just come up. It's not like senators or representatives wake up one day and they're like, I'm going to go try to like find a compromise with my counterpart for a really politically hot button issue that's also like a really wonky policy issue. So there's a lot of work that led us to getting to these moments that many individuals did. And to your question, Alida, I was very young. I was, I think, about a year out of college, of even that. And I remember graduating in 2016, and I was excited, and I thought that I was going to move to Washington, D.C. and pass immigration reform under a Clinton administration. And obviously that was not the case or the reality whatsoever. And I remember being in a lot of these spaces and being very aware of my age, the color of my skin, my immigration status, and choosing often to not let that hold me back, but to find power in those identities and the ability to come across to these policymakers and their staff in a way that shared my story and the stories of so many others, and grounding myself in that. And I think for folks here who are students, it's like being reminded that your age and your experience as it relates to work is not the only thing that is the most important thing often in these conversations, is reminding yourself of what you're doing and the why, and bringing the why into a lot of those spaces and trusting yourself, your instinct and your expertise, even if you feel like you haven't been doing this work for decades, like some others in the room maybe. That does not mean your opinion is any less valid. And for this particular instance in 2017, we had come off a lot of the public feeling really angry about the election of Donald Trump. And they knew that he had run an anti-immigrant platform, and therefore they were more easily captivated by the issue of immigration, which can be really hard because, again, immigration is really wonky, and it's also politically a hot button issue. So both sides don't always know how to message around it in a way that's proactive to creating space for us to pass these policies. But we were really successful in really being able to activate so many different stakeholders around the country and getting them to put the pressure on their representatives. Because again, members of Congress don't just wake up and decide to do something often. They have to be persuaded or pressured into doing that. So a really good example is that there was a university letter that came out around that time, and it was, I don't know, Alida or Ali, who does a lot of university work, like how many universities were on it?
Like over 2.
So over 200 universities from around the country that sent a letter saying that Congress needs to, I believe, like pass a prioritized legislation for DACA recipients. There were business leaders who came together, Apple, Google, Microsoft, sending these letters, really putting this pressure on members of Congress. There are folks just like us who are living across the country who were being activated to call them member of Congress. So we needed to create the pressure, the momentum, and the political space for that to happen. And the political space oftentimes can mean, what is the conservative member in a moderate Republican state saying to that member? What are they putting in the news that could persuade that member to feel like they have the political cover to say something positive on this issue or to co-sponsor a bill and not have that fear about what happened to their reelection, which is very real and something that we often come across in these spaces. So how are you creating these coalitions? How are you activating people who may care about this issue and providing them the tools and the resources to make that ask, to put that story in the local newspaper, to have a private meeting with that member of Congress when they're back in state, so that you're creating the situation for these kinds of things to be possible. And at the same time, we're also doing the DC lobbying work.
So talk to me about that lobbying work and you're sitting in the room with, let's go to 2018. So in 2018, Republicans were in the majority, right? No. Yes. It's been so many fights. The beginning of 2018, Republicans were in the majority.
Yes.
Then they weren't in November or the following January. And so Maria helped lead an effort that was around something called a discharge petition. Has anyone heard anything about a discharge petition before? Maybe if you've seen the movie Legally Blonde too. Elle Woods runs a discharge petition campaign. So discharge petition is like a super wonky thing where essentially the party, you can force a floor vote through a certain number of signatures on a discharge petition. So in that instance, if you had all of the Democrats who are in the minority plus a certain number of House Republicans joining them, they could have forced a vote on the discharge petition. And this is an election year. So Democrats also have interests of not working with Republicans because they want to point out how bad they are. So the idea of partnering with who they are deeming the bad guy is something that is kind of viewed as, in many ways, betrayal or against the electoral interests of Democrats at that time. And during this fight, we actually partnered with Congressman Aguilar, who at that time was super young, scrappy member, who was willing to do the organizing work of engaging with Republicans. And I think it's pretty rare that you'll find members of Congress who are actually willing to, on an ongoing basis, have those conversations across the aisle. There's a lot of risk for them to be doing that. And in Congressman Aguilar, we really found like a champion who was just committed to the issue because it impacted his constituents and sort of the county east of LA County. And he was just working real hard. And so, Maria, if you could take us back to that year, like what it was like working with Republicans and trying to get Republican House members to essentially buck their leadership and move to Democrats, and like what were those conversations like with those members? And what arguments did you find like actually persuaded those that I think we fell short like 2 signatures on that discharge petition? We were somewhere around there. It was really close.
Wow, this was a really long time ago. I think with any issue, you're gonna have members who are supportive, and at the same time, members who are politically scared. And you also might have folks or members who aren't supportive, but they politically feel like they have to do something to be reelected. And that was one of the main things I remember using during that time with the House Republicans. It was after the Trump the 2016 election. So the country was paying attention to a lot of these things. And I think the Republicans felt eyes within a lot of moderate districts. And I think our target was a little bit over 20 moderate Republicans, where we knew and they knew that their election was up for grabs. And like immigration might not have been the only issue that was going to determine their election, but they knew that they had to be good or show that they were trying to actually pass proactive policy around some of the issues that appeal to moderate voters and or swing voters. And immigration was one of those for many of those districts. So if we're thinking about some places in Southern California, a lot of places in Texas, in Southern Florida, I believe there's like a district in Miami that has flipped red to blue, blue to red multiple times over the past year. Where immigration is an important issue because there's a lot of immigrants, there's a lot of families who have immigrants, there's swing districts. Those members felt like they needed to act on this in order to be reelected and have the opportunity to come back to Congress, regardless of how much they actually cared about the policy itself. And we were really, we worked with many to make sure that they felt that pressure, not just from the DC lobbying, but again, from activating in their districts. So how many op-eds from stakeholders were being placed in those districts? Is a university president who lives in Southern Miami placing something about the need for Congress to act and calling out their representative? Are we engaging businesses to call them? Are constituents calling them? So a lot of the conversations was about showing them how this is good politics and how it's good policy, and also learning like, what do you need to be able to take this vote, and how can we, not we as in forward, but like we as the immigrant rights movement and other stakeholders engaged in this work, help provide that cover for you to feel comfortable taking that stance at a time where it could be really hard for them to do so. So we did a lot of our strategy around thinking around how we could move these 20 moderate Republicans who were in those moderate districts, swing districts. And like Alida said, we came really close. We had 2 left, but no one wants to be the last one. It's like no one wants to be the first one, and then no one wants to be the last one who actually gets you across the threshold. And that's really where we ended up hitting a wall because these 2 members now got all the focus of then Speaker Paul Ryan. And he just focused so much on them. He gave them like other alternatives. He really pressured them away because ultimately, if the discharge petition had been successful, it's also an embarrassment on the leadership of whomever is running the House at that point, because they completely disregarded leadership to get to these efforts.
And I think something that we talk about bipartisanship a lot, and sometimes it can be in the frame of like, what are you doing to persuade a Republican? But a lot of the times it's also like, what are you doing to facilitate compromise on the left too? And I think that that's like a real conversation that we're not always having. Sometimes I may argue because some of our arguments are rooted in more facts than others, but to be real, like at the end of the day, if an immigration bill is to pass this United States Congress or any Congress in the upcoming future, compromise will have to be a part of the deal. And cultivating a willingness to even have discussion around compromise is actually a difficult bipartisan tactic that one has to take on also on the left. And so, one thing that I have had personal struggles with in my own career as someone who's trying to find deal space, and in the spirit of Sine around like having hard conversations is how is a willingness to have a hard conversation not a reflection of your morality? And I think oftentimes we will have sort of like litmus tests of like how down you are as blockers to engaging in conversation and debate. And so, if you look at the 2018 deal of McCain-Coons, that was 110 million a year for 5 years. So not even $1 billion in border security. When Maria and I were working on that bill, we were like called sellouts. We were like demonized. We were told that we were like, turning our backs on the movement. But all these other deals are like $25 billion, right? So, and then if you think about how many billions have gone to the border over this period of time of inaction, it's actually many billions worth of border security. And so I think even like our frame of what is compromise is it changes in the day, and there isn't sort of like a rootedness in navigating that space. And so oftentimes it'll create a lot of fear for not only advocates to engage in both parties of the policymaking apparatus, but also members of Congress. Like now we will have meetings with members of Congress and they will literally say to us, we're not doing that unless you tell me all of these organizations sign off, because they're scared of actually doing the next step to move something along if they're going to be politically hit by the left. It's not just fears from the right, it's also fears from the left. And so I think that that's like a real thing on all issues, not just immigration, that it's a hard conversation, because like, what do? Do you sacrifice? Does that mean that you are that your value system is lesser than? How do you achieve incremental progress to actually provide relief to people who need relief, or do you hold out on that relief for the pure best policy possible in the future? These questions don't have the right answers, but they are ones that definitely shape the experience of policymakers. And so I'm curious, Maria, from your vantage point, what it's been like to build coalition on the left. So like, let's take 2021 Build Back Better Act. So this is President Biden's budget reconciliation bill. This is the big climate bill that's now like all the climate money. But at the time it was climate, it was care, like domestic workers, paid leave. It was all the progressive priorities we're getting on this budget reconciliation, including immigration. And so you have a Democratic trifecta. So you have the Senate, you have the House, and you have the presidency. So everyone's like, how do I go get my thing in all of what I want now? And so I was wondering if you'd take us into that circumstance, because you assume like, oh, we have all Democrats, we could get all of the things that we should want. But in many ways, it was a conversation around choice in limiting the number of people that could be a part of that deal. So curious if you talk about what those hard conversations were like.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognize you can see a lot of messaging, what people call messaging bills on the Hill. And then there's actual compromise. Like a messaging bill is the ideal policy for whomever is drafting it and supporting it. Like for me, it could be a pathway to all 11 million undocumented folks and opening up all the legal avenues so everyone can petition for their family members and employers can petition for employers, and like no trade-offs on enforcement. But the reality is that's not going to go anywhere with the political makeup that we have in Congress. So you can have messaging bills and people can get really excited and support those things. And I think that's also one of the things that happens with a lot of folks on the left. It's like, why are you going to support this bill when there's this other really great bill that does all the great things and doesn't give any trade-offs? And it's because the hard conversations and the reality is that in this political space, it will not pass. It will not get the votes and it will not pass. So what can actually pass within the political moment that we're in? And for the 2021 Build Back Better Act, it was like a roller coaster of a campaign to some extent, because every progressive issue wanted to get on this bill. Everyone was really excited that we had a Democratic trifecta. And as a reminder, it was very tight. It was 50 Democrats in the Senate. So VP Harris was the tie-breaking vote. The House was also tighter than many individuals anticipated it will be coming out of the election. So you have all these issues and everyone's trying to ride on this bill, because one thing is figuring out the policy and the bill and the compromise. Another one is thinking about how is it actually going to move? Are they actually going to bring it up for a vote? Do you need to attach it to something? So for the purposes of this, it was this really wonky reconciliation process, which meant that you only needed 50 votes in the Senate for it to pass. But it wasn't just needing these 50 votes. You also needed to get the approval of a parliamentarian who's an unelected staffer on the Hill, who basically says, yes, this can pass on this bill because it meets all these criteria, or no, it can't because it doesn't meet all the criteria. So a lot of the conversations here initially were, okay, we need to make sure that immigration is in. Like, there's all these issues, we all care about them. And I think a good point that I've heard from folks is like, you know, on the left, people care about so many issues, an inch deep. On the right, there's a few issues that people care about a foot deep. And immigration happens to be one of those, in my opinion, where progressives care about it, but it might not be the thing that they go to bat for. Whereas on the right, with a lot of conservative lawmakers, it's the thing that their base goes to bat for. So we were trying to get in. We had to have a lot of conversation with progressive partners, with other individuals and organizations that didn't work in immigration, to make sure that they were supportive of immigration being included in it. We had to make sure we're having conversations with Democratic lawmakers, specifically the champions on immigration over the past few years, to make sure that they were fighting for the issue on the inside. We needed to make sure that they were raising it within the caucus meetings, that they were raising it to leadership, that they were saying immigration has to move on this bill and it needs to be part of this process. And that took a lot of work, and we were successful in doing it. We were successful in making sure that immigration was a part of the conversations, and that Democrats, for the most part, had agreed to move it on what would be a party line exercise via this reconciliation process. And in doing so, we had to make tough decisions because, again, that parliamentarian, who is that unelected staffer who gets to decide yes or no, if it meets all this criteria, we had to think about policy that would protect as many people, but also pass that criteria through her lens. And that meant that it couldn't be a huge bill, unfortunately, that legalized all the undocumented folks. And you had a lot of people who were really upset because they said, what do you mean? We just came from 4 years of an administration that was so anti-immigrant. We have a Democratic trifecta. This is all we can do. And people were really pissed off, rightfully so. But the politics and the reality and the conditions that we were operating under meant that we couldn't do the big thing that we wanted to do, even though we had just experienced 4 years of really anti-immigrant policies, even though we had a Democratic trifecta, and we had to scale it back, and we had to be strategic and think about what could pass. And as listed here, it was a pathway for 7 million folks, it's a ton of people, right? It's estimated around 11 million people. But people were still upset. And again, rightfully so, because they expect more. So it had to be a lot of conversations with partners to get them to understand why we were making these choices. And not we at Forward, but we, as in terms of many folks within the immigrant rights movement and many members of Congress, why it was the right strategic choice to make. And even in thinking about these different policies, like the parliamentarian ultimately still said no, whether you think that's justified or not. But it was hard, you know, like. And if you ask me, it makes so much sense. It's like, what do you mean this is all we can do after all this time? It was a real disappointment for people. But I think one of the big things in learning and going through all this work is that you're never going to please everyone. So how can you protect as many people as possible and then worry about the pleasing after? Because it's at the heart of my work. It's like delivering protections for folks so they're no longer living in fear of deportation and they can have a dignified life in the country they call home. And then what are the hard conversations you have to have in order to make that possible?
And we'll get into discussion now for Q&A now, but that kind of leads us where we're at now, which is we had a Democratic trifecta and in the 50 vote process, in the Senate, basically the parliamentarian said, you can't do this type of immigration law in reconciliation. So that what that means is that we're in a 60 vote scenario in the United States Senate from here forth on trying to move an immigration bill. So by definition, bipartisanship, if we want to pass a pathway to citizenship, needs to be at the core of any strategy to actually deliver protections for people. And that's really sort of the road ahead. And so, where does that leave us now? On May 11th, this is sad. I'm going to end my last seminar with a cliffhanger. So, but on May 11th,
We'll bring you back.
thanks. I'll report out. President Biden will be ending the national emergency declaration on COVID, which the use of a border policy, or not a border, that's funny. The use of a public health policy from the CDC called Title 42 has been basically a catch-all for border management for 2020 and the Trump years, and then the last 2.5 years of the Biden, or not half, but whatever the math is on the Biden administration. And what that policy does is essentially enable Border Patrol to not open the ports of entry and process people seeking asylum. So if COVID is over on May 11th, so is Title 42 that's keeping people out because of COVID. And so what that means is Border Patrol, after 2 years plus of not really having to do their jobs, is going to have to process people. But over those 2 years, there's now probably like 100,000 people in northern Mexico that have come to seek asylum and haven't been able to because our door's been closed to that process. And so all of those people will have rights again. Well, their rights never left, but their rights were put on pause by a BS policy. Now we will have to process them. And so you all are going to start to see stuff in the news about like the Biden border crisis is coming. How will this impact the 2024 election? You'll start to see Republican governors sort of like gearing up for May 11th. And we'll probably see crowding at a port of entry. There'll probably be a couple ports of entry that will, get a few hundred people who show up who are trying to get processed. And those folks are going to jam up a system or two. And so the system's going to have this appearance of breaking, but it's not breaking. It's just turning back on after being off. And so it's going to be a rocky summer. Migration usually goes up in the United States in the summer months. More people are migrating during that period of time. And we're also at sort of historic highs in those numbers. And so where that leaves us in the sort of border debate, supplementing the broader CIR debate, is I think you'll start to see more Senator Tillis and Senator Sinema kind of continuing to merge the two. And it's a question, and a question that I think is going to continue to be called publicly, which is, do the policymakers have the capacity to think about our broken immigration system and the people who are already in the United States suffering from that broken system at the same time that they can think about a process to orderly process asylum seekers? Right now, the answer is no. These members of Congress do not have the mental capacity or the political fortitude to understand that immigration is broader than that. And so our policy debate is very limited and defined in the invasion politics of the crises. But I think you'll start to see a merger where those of you that were calling out different parts of CIR, traditionally asylum has not been a forward-leaning talking point of CIR as a policy compromise. And I think, we're headed in a direction where it will now be a given that changes to the asylum system are a part of that deal space. And that is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable as to whether or not they're going to come to the table. And so I actually think we're in like a mission critical time around the concept of legalization of immigrants in America and what the political opportunities are. And if the merger of those two issues policy-wise are going to be so strong that like it's actually not possible in the near term to move something forward. I think that, you know, we'll see that over the months and year ahead. But with that, we'd love to open it up for questions for the last few minutes we have here. If anyone has any thoughts, you can also ask Maria what it's like in the Oval Office, because she's been there twice if you have one. Go ahead, Jack.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm interested to see, you know, we've talked a lot about working with Republicans in Congress. What has it been like working with Democrats? Now you've seen them in the minority, they went back to majority, and now we're in minority again. And on the House side, what has that changed thing? What has that been like?
Just as bad. Sorry.
Well,
You can answer too.
To be fully transparent, you still have to get them to care and to have those conversations. And oftentimes, like to reach across the aisle to have those conversations, kind of to what Alida was saying. And it's really hard to get them to care. It's like, we shouldn't have to use so much persuasion or show all this polling or engage all these stakeholders to convince many of these members who run on platforms that say they support these policies to actually prioritize these policies. And, you know, members of Congress have a ton of things going on. They have to worry not just about immigration, but multiple things. They're worrying about the reelection, their families, and so forth. But it shouldn't be so hard. So not impossible, but not also like a walk in the park working with Democrats. And you have to know who your champions are, and also who's going to be listened to within the caucus, because different members hold different levers of power and can bring more folks along with them. So you're thinking about constantly, how are you engaging them? What tools are you giving them? And how are you basically like building the platform for them to walk on as it relates to engaging on these efforts?
I think also like the good and the bad of like 2-year terms in the House in particular is that there's a lot of transition. Like staff moves around, who's in charge of a different caucus moves around. So, you know, we've been able to help with others organize this many like actual almost vote opportunities in the last few years, which is a lot. Not every issue has been able to like get their stuff to the floor. But you really got to kind of like you got to hold the issue more than the members are, and you got to plan their transitions in advance, because every 2 years you got a new crop, a new head of the CHC, a new, you know, head of the New Dems caucus, a new staffer who's now in charge of all of the policy briefings. Like, you got to like stay on it in order to keep it moving. Do you have a question?
So going off of your question, when cinema changed from Democrat to independent, how did that change how you engage with her? I think just today she was at the border with Congressman Tony Gonzalez, who represents the biggest border district in Texas. So how did that political change how you
On the pulse. I like.
You know, I actually don't think a lot changed with Senator Sinema's from the moment that she identified as a Democrat to when she identifies as an independent. I think a lot has changed with her over the course of her political career in Congress. She was very progressive when she was in the House of Representatives. And now, for whichever reasons, whether it's her statewide politics or other things, she has chosen to move more to the center. But I will give her credit on the sense that she is actually trying to make it work, and she is trying to find compromise and common ground in a setting where that's really difficult. But from my experience, she I think like some of that fear we were talking about before can sometimes be real for her, because she's coming from a really intense state where the border is a big thing, asylum is a big thing. They have a lot of immigrants, a lot of undocumented immigrants. It was like the battleground for immigration for quite some time, and still could be depending on who you ask. So I think she has to manage her policy. She tries to manage them in the way that she thinks makes the most sense. And whether or not you agree or whether or not it'll be successful, like, I don't know what's going to happen in 24 with Congresswoman Diego running and her running as an independent. Like, is that going to split the Democratic independent vote and then it goes to a Republican? Like, who knows? But I think for her, she just doesn't always traditionally engage with a lot of folks. She's more careful about her engagement, but at the same time, you see her actually having these conversations.
And Rep. Gonzalez is another good example. So that 2018 McCain, Coons, Hurd, Aguilar, Gonzalez is Hurd.
Yeah.
So like that's the same district. And Congressman Will Hurd was really active on immigration. It's a border district, a lot of border patrol in that district. But a lot of like Latinos and immigrants as well. And you're seeing in Rep. Gonzalez's sort of anger of he's a Republican of his own party right now, which is he's sort of like in this fight with Chip Roy, who is not a moderate and is, you know, much more on the right, a member who is like trying to move a very extreme border bill in through the Republican House right now. And he's kind of like, that's not a serious bill. Like he being Gonzalez is calling his colleagues out saying that's not a real bill. A real bill, if you want border security, is also going to deal with the undocumented. We all know that. We need to have a real conversation.
That's a good example of messaging bill.
Yeah, it's a good example of a messaging bill. And so the Cinema Gonzalez example is these are two outliers, right? And for our issue, it's kind of like, well, we kind of want the outliers to win. Like, could they build a coalition? Could they bring more people to the table? Could they have more uncomfortable conversations? Because we actually, that's what we need, is we need the real talk. We need the real talk across party lines where people are like, I would be willing to vote for this. There's a lot of posturing that doesn't get to that real conversation. And so I think what the two of them are trying to do as border members is to educate other members of Congress about what is real and what is not in the conversation. And maybe I don't agree with 100% of what they do, but I'm actually like quite grateful that they're trying. Any other questions?
One there.
Yes. In the back.
Hey, hi. So I'm sitting all the way in the back. So as sort of a two-part question, maybe not cohesive. The first question, just out of curiosity, with the 2022 bill. So how much, because you can really see the difference between a lot of the other bills, how much of the emphasis on border patrol, on agents, on security, surveillance is because there was an awareness that the COVID Act would end and we would need all these potential people to fill these positions in order to process, or how much of it was Republican, I assume, or conservative sort of blowback of this idea of we really need to, build this wall, we need to secure, these are, dangerous people coming in. Because I'm also noticing how little also, right, 2 million versus 7 million, all these drops. So was there, when you were discussing these issues, what was your feeling from the parties at hand?
So, this is in the context of the last 2 years and where we have migration high. And, that's not like a Joe Biden thing. That's like there are dictators in South America thing. Like it gets painted by Republicans as like Joe Biden's policies, but these are Donald Trump's policies that Joe Biden is implementing. And, as we saw in 2019 after family separation where Donald Trump stole people's children, like migration went up. So one thing is like this global debate around deterrence as an idea at our southern border. Like, is deterrence the way to convince people in other countries to not come to America? My argument is no. Deterrence is not good policy. It's proven itself to be horrible policy by multiple presidents. They've all tried it. And like we got to the level of stealing children and it still didn't work. So like deterrence is not going to stop people from trying to save their lives and coming here. What Maria and I work on is that we believe we need to create more legal pathways in other countries for people to actually come here rather than going through the cartels and the smuggling networks. But that is not at the substitution of asylum policy. And that's a little bit of the debate that we're at right now with the Biden administration is they're putting forward policies that in many ways could be viewed as a substitution for asylum policy. But as we saw with Venezuelans over the last, 6-8 months, is once they created a legal pathway for Venezuelans to apply, border numbers of Venezuelans crossing decreased because there was an avenue through our system for people. People don't want to like break the law. Like people want, if there's a process, people will use the process. And so I lost your, to get back to where we're at, we're in the context of of Title 42 and of high migration. And I think that that is the reality of where Senator Sinema is living, in particular because the Yuma sector is just like a very low capacity NGO infrastructure area and high capacity in terms of the number of migrants that are showing up, not every day, but in different parts of the day. And it's like a political hotbed of Arizona on this topic. And so I think for her, part of it is like making sure that fixing our asylum system is a part of the conversation. I may disagree with all of the contours of that deal space, but I understand where some of it's coming from. So when you beef up port of entry agents, those are like the people that are actually at the front door of the United States. I want loads more ports of entry agents. That's like actually what we need. We don't necessarily need 20,000 Border Patrol agents or however many it was, but the port guys and gals, we need all of them. So border processing centers, like we need more of those. We don't want those to be jails for families, but we want them to be functional, humane processing centers. So there's some stuff where we can have real conversation here. And so I think it was good that they put stuff on the table because it defined more where Senator Tillis was at, which, you know, gives some clarity to like, what are the actual hard conversations we need to have.
I think in addition to that, it's like understanding what, based on what Alida shared in the political moment, what is needed to get more members on. So for this particular conversation, we had 50 Democrats, assuming all 50 Democrats are supportive, and that is never like a guarantee. It was only 10, I guess 12, 13 years ago where you had 5 Democrats voting against the DREAM Act in 2010, right? It's not a guarantee that you're always going to get every Democrat, and we don't always, but if we had all 50, we still needed 10 Republicans. So Senator Tillis, who's the one working it, he has to know what needs to be included in order to get those 10 to really 12 or so Republicans. And some of them really just need cover, and some of them actually are looking for specific policy. And an example is in like 2013, when they were doing a big comprehensive immigration reform, I think it was Senator Hoeven, who they were trying to get on. And if he got on, he was going to get like 3 more Republicans on or something like that. And he wanted, I forgot how much, but X amount of money for border. So they actually created like the Hoeven Amendment that was a ton of money for border, but that allowed the Gang of 8, who were the members compromising this bill, to bring on him and like 2 or 3 more Republican senators, which they needed ultimately if they wanted to get 60 plus votes to pass in the Senate. So sometimes it's just it's what the Tillis and Sinema want, but also like what else do you need to get the votes that you need? And also at the same time, not to talk too much, it's like when you push it too far, that then you lose some of the members in your own party. And how do we and others, like how do you build that framework for them to feel like they can engage and take what might feel risky to see like the broader good or the good that will come out of it?
Back.
Yeah, can I follow up on that? So that's what you're just, I mean, you're reminding us, it's all about politics now.
Yeah.
Right. And things are so polarized and partisan. What issues are there, or what is the path and strategies that you're using to either very specific narrative, like will the DREAM Act, will DACA, what are there areas for compromise? Because as you say, it's not always just the Republicans. I mean, is there compromise on border security and an appropriate border security? What are those opportunities right now?
Yeah, so this is like a core question of the movement at large, which is, are we breaking away from the political compromise of CIR? And is it time to move towards piecemeal opportunities to make some progress? Or what are the opportunities with the executive? So President Biden could tomorrow redesignate TPS, this is temporary protected status, for Honduras, El Salvador, he can create it for Guatemala, Nicaragua. That all of a sudden can cover like millions of people in the United States, and that doesn't require an act of Congress. And so I think part of it is like, what are big things that can happen that we can access and influence the power structure to do outside of the United States Congress? And then the other is, within the boundaries of the Congress, what can actually grow a coalition. And so I believe that there's still a coalition that'll vote to pass the DREAM Act. I don't know that I believe it'll happen before the Supreme Court hears the case. So like, I think Congress acts in urgent times, and I think that that is a very sad but real urgency marker that it will probably come, in the next 18 months or so. So that's one issue. I think that there's bipartisanship around attracting talent to the United States. So this sometimes can be framed in the context of business interests that our friend in the back referenced. But, there's people at American University right now with timelines on their departure to the United States who are here on student visas, who are going to go, and maybe while they're here, they like their time. They're like, actually, I want to work here. And it might be in the interest of the United States to retain that talent. And so one bipartisan area that I think is on the table on immigration is around, I think they should be expanded. Right now, they're more limited in conversation around STEM, but I think that there's potential for provisions like that to move forward. I think in bad ways, border security is on the table. I think we will see how people overreact after the May 11th date that I just discussed. And I think that there are risks involved with the political narrative and Democrats feeling like they need to show that they're doing something on border. I don't want to believe that they would in the Senate pass a standalone border bill, but who knows? I don't know, anything else, Maria, on your mind? Those are two that pop for me that I do think have a real shot in the next, this Congress to build some steam and next Congress to make some moves, feel like real opportunities.
I think the other one would be the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is very much for a tailored population. But there's good arguments for both sides of the aisle to want to do that. These are folks from Afghanistan who are currently on parole, and that's gonna it can get extended by the administration, but a future administration can get rid of it, and it offers no stability. It's similar to the DACA program; it's 2-year increments, and these are folks who risk their life to help the U.S. And there's a lot of them. There's thousands of them in the U.S. Who have no idea what their future holds for them. And last Congress, they tried to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. It was blocked by some senators in the Senate, but it continues to be up in conversation and policy that both sides of the aisle tend to be supportive of.
Yeah. So all is not lost. There are opportunities on the table. So thank you for the question. Yes.
So, most recent polls indicate that American.
Whose most recent poll?
Politico.
Great.
The latest
Thank you.
one I read. But most do indicate that one of Joe Biden's worst ranking issues is immigration. And actually 2023, it has shown the lowest approval rating regarding our immigration system. It's a little confusing because we don't know if it's you're bad because you're too right wing, too left wing. But what do you think this is happening? Why are people more dissatisfied now than under Trump even?
So this is a great point on a variety of fronts. So I don't know the exact numbers, but it's actually been this case since 2021 where the president's approval ratings, where people are disapproving of him or is his handling of immigration. Now, I may argue that for some voters, like you mentioned, that's just inaction on doing some of the good on immigration. And then for others who have been receiving nightly Biden border crisis news on Fox News, it's actually a perceived real, both political and policy problem that he is facing. And so I think the politics of that number are also shaping how much runway those of us have as advocates actually have to push him on the policies. And so I think it's a mixture of stuff that's happening in those polls on approvals, because I think Americans are also just tired of nothing happening on immigration. overall, and they just kind of want to see like action. And, you know, I would make the argument that maybe he's not actually messaging an active vision on this issue that like is able to give people the confidence. The administration has actually done a lot of good things that they haven't really talked about out loud. You could guess for a variety of reasons as to why. And so, you know, I don't have an answer to, I think the answer is what your instinct is, that that's a mix. It's like a mix of people receiving an actively chosen campaign from the Republicans that they said that they were taking on the beginning of 2021, which is like a Biden border crisis narrative. And they've held throughout for the last 2 years, and that actually creating a dip in the polls. And they've done that through these border trips of going down there every week. Another group is going down. They get the local news clips, they get the national clips. They show images of 15 people crossing a river. Those people aren't sneaking in, they're asking for asylum. It's like, it's all theater. But you do that every day, people start to really believe that the border is open and there's chaos. So I think that that's a little bit of what we're facing there on that question. All right, Ava's shutting me down. Well, I just want to say thank you all for coming, and thank Maria for joining us. It's been really fun. We have a virtual career conversation on the 26th, where we'll talk about job stuff. So if anybody wants to work in this field or related fields, please join us. We'll talk about all those things.
Yeah, we are really excited to have a career conversation with Alida coming up on that day, on the 26th. 26th. And we also have our career conversations with other fellows. If you take a look at the flyer that's on your seat, we have plenty more events coming up for the end of the semester. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.